First at 10 is a story many people haven't heard, many people have heard, I should say, but not all of them believed.
On the night of October 11th, 1973, in Pascagoula, Mississippi, Calvin Parker and Charles Hixon, two co-workers from a local shipyard, decided to relax after a long day by fishing at a quiet spot by the water. As they talked about their work, families, and life in general, they had no idea that their lives were about to take a terrifying turn.
Shelby?
Yeah, Byron Lanise, Calvin Parker is always interested when UFO sightings or talk of aliens make national headlines. He's hoping to get some kind of answer as to what happened to him on the banks of the Pascagoula River all those years ago.
At first, the large UFO they saw didn't scare them. It was what came out of it that did. These weren't the typical small, pale beings with big black eyes.
And it was three bulky-looking creatures.
The creatures that appeared were more monstrous, and the closer they got, the more fear gripped Calvin and Charles. As the creatures approached, both men found themselves suddenly paralyzed. They could no longer run, move, or call for help. All they could do was wait, helpless, to see what would happen next. Without warning, the creatures grabbed them, lifting the men onto the craft, their bodies still frozen. And that's when their nightmare truly began.
Still, nearly 50 years later, Calvin Parker is sticking to his story.
He says he was abducted by something out of this world in Pascagoula back in the 70s. And with all the recent UFO sightings, our Shelby Myers wanted to check in on Parker.
After a long day at work, Charles Hixon and Calvin Parker had decided to do some fishing by the Pascagoula River. They found a quiet spot on a pier, thinking they would unwind in peace. But soon they noticed a blue light in the sky. It grew brighter as it approached, revealing a disc-shaped craft about 40 feet long and 10 feet tall. It hovered above the water, making an unsettling, buzzing sound. 3 creatures floated out from the craft, levitating above the ground. About 5 feet tall, with pale, wrinkled skin, their heads were directly connected to their shoulders. Their faces were grotesque, with sharp protrusions in place of noses and ears. Their large, round eyes seemed lifeless. Instead of hands, they had crab-like claws at the ends of their arms. As these creatures drew closer, Charles and Calvin found themselves paralyzed with fear. But soon, they realized it wasn't just fear. They weren't in control of their bodies anymore. The creatures had done something to them, leaving them powerless to move. The beings grabbed Calvin and Charles by their claws, lifting them off the ground. The men felt weightless. Overcome with fear, Calvin fainted, and he was lucky. Charles felt numb and detached, as if his mind had separated from his body. The beings carrying Charles and Calvin floated back to the craft. As they neared the ship, a section of the hull rippled like water. The metal disappeared, forming an entrance. Charles could only move his eyes, now bombarded by blinding light. His mind raced. He couldn't move, couldn't see. He was trapped. He felt the creatures surrounding him, cold claws pressing against his skin. He shut his eyes and hoped it was all just a dream. He prayed to wake up. His prayers went unanswered. This wasn't a dream. It was a nightmare, and he was wide awake. And the nightmare had just begun. Calvin woke up on a flat, metallic surface inside the alien craft. He was in a round room lit by harsh white light that seemed to radiate from the walls. The air felt thick, with a metallic scent like ozone after a lightning strike, and something sour, like ammonia. As Calvin's eyes adjusted, he noticed he wasn't alone. A female alien stood over him. She looked different from the others, more humanoid, with large almond-shaped eyes and delicate features. She tried to reassure Calvin telepathically that he was safe, but it didn't work. A sense of dread filled him as she began examining him, pressing on different parts of his body. The female alien stepped back and telepathically said, "I'm not going to hurt you." She pinched his cheek, slid her hand down to his mouth, and forced his jaw open. Long, thin probes grew from the middle fingers of her other hand. She shoved her middle fingers down Calvin's throat and pushed them upward toward his nasal cavity. Sharp pain shot through him, and he tried to scream, but he couldn't. He was choking. He heard her voice again, "Don't be afraid." Then she pulled something from his nose. In another room, Charles was facing a similar ordeal. 3 of the original beings surrounded him, using their claws to examine his body. Their movements were stiff, almost mechanical. They communicated telepathically, but unlike the others, they weren't offering reassurance. Instead, they were delving into his mind, dissecting his thoughts and memories. He tried to fight back, but he was powerless. A metal object, roughly the size of a football, hovered over him. It seemed to scan his body, moving up and down before circling around his head. As Calvin and Charles endured their procedures, they saw other beings moving around, performing tasks. Some were still, watching them closely. Consoles with blinking lights and holographic symbols filled the rooms. The symbols shifted and changed, resembling hieroglyphics. They moved as the beings worked. Both men sensed that the craft wasn't just a machine. It felt alive, aware of them. They could feel it, probing their minds, watching them. The craft emitted a rhythmic buzzing sound, disorienting them to the point of nausea. It was becoming overwhelming. Flashing symbols, strange sounds, shifting lights, and odd smells. The whole experience was like a twisted nightmare, one the human mind couldn't process. Calvin, still under the alien's examination, felt himself losing consciousness. As his awareness slipped away, a vision of hundreds, maybe thousands, of human faces flashed before him, each one marked by terror and confusion. Then realization hit him. He and Charles weren't unique. This horrifying nightmare was far more common than anyone knew. The last thing Calvin remembered before everything went dark were the female alien's eyes. She seemed to be trying to tell him something important, but he couldn't understand it in time. Calvin Parker and Charles Hixon woke up on the riverbank, confused and scared. The craft was gone. They thought hours had passed, but only 20 minutes had gone by. Once they collected themselves, they decided to report what had happened. They first called the Air Force, but the response was dismissive. They were told to go to the police. The Air Force doesn't deal with UFOs. At the station, they told the sheriff and other officers everything. Although the officers were doubtful, they could hear genuine fear in their voices and decided to test them. Calvin and Charles were left alone in a room, unaware their conversation was being recorded. The officers expected they would say something that would ruin their story. Instead, the recording only supported it. Calvin and Charles discussed the incident in a state of fear, with no hint of dishonesty. "I had been through enough hell on this earth, and now I got to go through something like this." The recording, later known as the secret tape, became a critical piece of evidence supporting their claims. It was clear that Calvin and Charles truly believed every word of their story. Many people believed something extraordinary took place on the Pascagoula River that night. Meanwhile, other witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the sky. Official records show over 50 separate calls to the police that evening. Many people described seeing a large oval craft with blue lights, just as Calvin and Charles had. The news spread fast. Media outlets, UFO enthusiasts, and skeptics all flocked to the small town, with Calvin and Charles at the heart of the attention. This brought both fame and criticism, though both men passed multiple lie detector tests. It's often advised to avoid taking a lie detector test. The incident affected the men in different ways. Charles continued to speak publicly about it, while Calvin, dealing with PTSD, preferred to stay out of the spotlight. The Pascagoula UFO event had an unexpected impact. It highlighted the fact that alien abductions were more common than anyone had realized. The Pascagoula case is chilling, but it's not the only one. Over the years, many people have come forward with their own stories of alien encounters and abductions. You might recognize some of them. One of the most well-known cases is the 1961 abduction of Betty and Barney Hill in New Hampshire. The Hills claimed they were taken by small beings with gray skin and large eyes, who examined them aboard a spacecraft. In 1975, Travis Walton's abduction, witnessed by his logging crew, made headlines. Walton vanished after a UFO was spotted in the Sitgreaves National Forest. His crew saw him struck by a beam of light before the UFO disappeared with him. He was missing for 5 days, sparking a widespread search. When Travis returned, he claimed he had been aboard a ship with small creatures with large eyes, and later encountered taller, more human-like beings. In 1985, Whitley Strieber was abducted from his cabin in upstate New York. He described his abductors as short, with large eyes and heads. Strieber later wrote Communion, a book detailing his experience, where he shared vivid accounts of the painful procedures he endured, including a needle being inserted into his brain and the use of an anal probe. Communion became a bestseller and reignited public interest in alien abductions. It was even adapted into a movie. The film wasn't well received, but it stars Christopher Walken, and he's always entertaining to watch. The Allagash abductions in 1976 involved 4 men on a camping trip in Maine. They were taken aboard a craft and examined by beings with large heads, long necks, and slim bodies. Like the Pascagoula incident, this event had multiple witnesses. These cases share common details: paralysis, levitation, telepathic communication, and invasive procedures. While most abductions are isolated events, with the victims left traumatized but untouched after the experience, some cases are just the beginning. Charles Hixon's Pascagoula incident was only the start. Over the years, he had several more alien encounters. In January 1974, a female entity visited his home. He described her as tall and beautiful, with pale skin and large almond-shaped eyes. Hixon continued having encounters through the early 1980s, ranging from brief UFO sightings to physical contact with various alien races. Many of these aliens expressed concern about Earth's environment and pollution. They were also concerned about nuclear weapons. Some brought up free energy. One group suggested humans were placed on Earth as an experiment. Another showed Charles visions of their homeworld and advanced technology. Perhaps we've never been visited by aliens because they have looked upon Earth and decided there's no sign of intelligent life. Neil deGrasse Tyson. In 1983, Charles claimed he received an alien implant to track him and monitor his health. These encounters made Charles well known in the UFO community. As his stories grew more complex, they became controversial. Some dismissed his claims as an attempt to gain attention, while others believed aliens were particularly interested in Charles. One thing that stands out about his stories is how, when challenged in interviews, he often responded, "Oh, I answer that in my book." The Pascagoula UFO incident is considered one of the most credible alien abduction stories. 2 consistent witnesses, a secret recording backing their claim, and others reporting seeing the craft. But is it true? Charles Hixon and Calvin Parker's accounts are thorough and consistent, but there is no physical evidence. Let's consider a possible psychological explanation. Hypnagogic hallucinations are vivid experiences that occur between wakefulness and sleep, which feel completely real. These can include seeing strange figures, hearing voices, or feeling a presence. The paralysis described by Charles and Calvin is similar to sleep paralysis. As your brain enters sleep, it shuts down motor functions to prevent you from acting out dreams. Normally, we're unaware when this happens, but if you're awake during sleep paralysis, it can be frightening. I'm a lucid dreamer, and one of the hardest parts of learning to lucid dream is overcoming the fear of sleep paralysis. You often hear buzzing sounds during this state. I've heard it. Charles also mentioned hearing buzzing sounds. Many alien abduction stories share similarities with hypnagogic experiences, like seeing shadowy humanoid figures or the Hat Man. These figures often appear at the edge of perception, much like the aliens seen in abduction experiences. Another phenomenon is old hag syndrome, where people report seeing an old witch-like figure and feeling pressure on their body as it climbs on top of them. Some also feel pain or even sexual violation during paralysis. This resembles the experiences described by supposed abductees, including Charles and Calvin. It's possible Charles was experiencing a hypnagogic hallucination, with his mind filling in the gaps with details, especially since UFO stories were widely discussed at the time. What about Calvin Parker? How can two people have the same hypnagogic experience? Well, they can't. When Charles and Calvin went to the police, Calvin said he was asleep during the whole incident. It wasn't until later that the memories resurfaced. Plus, it was Calvin's first day on the job. He was just 19, while Charles, 43, was his superior and an authority figure. I'm not saying Calvin lied, but human memory isn't always reliable. If you hear the same story repeatedly, your brain can create memories of it, even if you didn't experience it yourself. Calvin was hospitalized for a few weeks after the incident due to stress, and was hospitalized a few more times over the years. By the way, the men had been drinking a bit before the incident, and a lot afterward. Charles's story evolved over the years. He added more details and, of course, released a book. Calvin stayed out of the public eye for about 20 years, but then he began speaking out and released his own book. There's always a book. Now, there are about 50 reports of strange objects in the sky with blue lights, but most came after the media coverage, though not all. There are plenty of reasons to be skeptical of the story, but also many details that remain unexplained. I doubt Charles had all those additional encounters, but I believe he thought the first one was real. Both men were psychologically affected. Maybe it was all in their heads, but the trauma is real. There are many people who believe they were abducted, assaulted, or violated by some otherworldly presence. Whether it was aliens, a spirit, a demon, or a shadow person, they suffer because of it for years. The Pascagoula incident, like so many other alleged alien encounters, leaves us questioning the boundaries of reality and perception. Whether it's a genuine experience or the mind playing tricks, the effects on those who go through it are undeniable. Such incidents have a profound impact on how we perceive and imagine extraterrestrial life. Over the years, they have shaped the way we think about aliens and their potential interactions with us. Stories like the Pascagoula incident, along with others from around the world, have contributed to the creation of a collective image of what an alien encounter might look like. Initially, alien sightings were vague, and descriptions varied widely, but as incidents like Pascagoula gained attention, a more consistent pattern began to emerge in the public's imagination. For instance, the typical gray alien, characterized by large black eyes and small bodies, became the dominant image. This archetype was popularized by abduction stories, movies, books, and even television shows. People began to associate these features with extraterrestrials. Over time, these representations began to define what we expect when we think about an alien encounter, despite the fact that we have no concrete proof that these beings actually exist. The media played a significant role in shaping this narrative. Skeptics argue that many of these incidents can be explained by sleep paralysis, psychological conditions, or even hoaxes. The debate over these events often centers around the lack of physical evidence, but this only further fuels the mystery. The absence of proof does not necessarily negate the reality of the experience. As a result, many people who have had these encounters cling to their stories, finding solace in a community of others who share their experiences. So, what are your thoughts on this? Tell us in the comments below and subscribe for more content.